Hi, everybody. I'm Steve Adler, Editor-in-Chief of Reuters, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's Reuters Newsmaker event with former Vice President, climate activist, and Nobel Peace Prize winner, Al Gore. And Vice President Gore, we're so delighted to have you with us, and particularly at a time that, frankly, is so momentous and perilous in our history. So thanks for being here. So the format's going to be basically, I'm going to ask a bunch of questions, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience to enable you to ask questions, and you'll see how to do that. But first of all, I do want to turn this over to an introduction from, I've got to say, my mentor, journalistic giant, one of the greatest journalists of all time, and I'm proud to say Reuters Editor-at-Large, Sir Harold Evans. And he's going to say a few words at the outset, and he will pose the first question. So over to Harry.
Thank you, Steve. Welcome, everyone. Today we have a guest who is speaking the inconvenient truth with extraordinary foresight for a very long time. Former Vice President and Nobel laureate Al Gore. He warned of the ticking time bomb on environmental crisis long before others understood it, much less had the political courage to say it. In awarding him the Nobel Peace Prize now 13 years ago, the Nobel Committee recognized him as probably the greatest single individual who has done the most to create worldwide understanding of climate change. Today, his work carries on through his Climate Reality Project, which trains climate activists worldwide. Now, as the COVID-19 pandemic has its all in its deadly grip, he has written another forceful op-ed calling for sustainable capitalism and arguing this global crisis should be viewed as an opportunity, a once-in-a-century obligation to rethink the relationship among business, markets, government, and society. He joins us now from Tennessee. Welcome to this Reuters forum, Al. And before Steve Adler drills down, let me ask you the first question. COVID-19 has driven climate change from the top of the news agenda. Agreed? Tell us why you think the topic is so crucially relevant during this global pandemic.
So, Mr. Gore, again, welcome again, and we're delighted to have you here with what seems to be some sort of universal image behind you, and maybe you'll explain to us what that is. Let's pick up on Harry's question. Why should we be paying attention to climate change right now when so many people, and it's now up over, I think, 177,000 in the US, are dying from COVID-19? Why climate change? Why should we be talking about that?
Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you, Harry, for your generous words during that introduction and for putting your finger on the question of the moment, the nexus between COVID-19 and the climate crisis. First of all, it would be surprising if this pandemic were not fully occupying our awareness right now with all of the deaths and all of the suffering. But I don't think it's a zero-sum contest for our attention. I actually think these two crises are very closely related. They have two similarities and two important differences, Steve. First of all, the pandemic reminds us that when the leading scientists who understand the most about the challenges we face are setting their hair on fire, so to speak, and trying to warn us of an impending disaster, it's best to pay attention. And for quite a few years, the best epidemiologists and virologists have been loudly warning us of a pandemic almost identical to the one that we're now struggling to overcome now. So when the climate scientists have been warning us for much longer of an even worse catastrophe because of the greenhouse gases disrupting the climate balance and much else besides, we need to pay attention to them. The second similarity is that both the pandemic and the climate crisis reveal the pre-existing inequities, the structural and institutional racism, the inequalities, and the unfairness in the structure and makeup of our economy and our society. Because in the case of the pandemic, the death rate among Black Americans is 2.2 times higher, and actually that understates the differential impact. And the climate crisis, as Pope Francis and many others have been pointing out for years, affects the poor and communities of color and the disadvantaged and persecuted first and worst. And if we had been more aware of their plight years ago, it could have given us a more vivid warning of what is in store for everyone else in the world. Now, here are the two differences. First of all, as the Secretary General of the United Nations has pointed out, the effects of this pandemic are measured in months and years, whereas the impacts of the climate crisis are measured in centuries, and if we don't get our act together, in millennia. And the other difference is also really important. We have had a partial shutdown of many economies in order to try to overcome the pandemic, so many jobs have been lost, at least temporarily. Some of them, unfortunately, may not come back, so we have to create new ones. And where the climate crisis is concerned, we don't have to shut down the economy. We can open the job-creating engine of the sustainability revolution. The fastest growing job in the United States is solar installer. For the last 5 years, those jobs have grown 5 times faster than average job growth. The second fastest growing job is wind turbine technician. The Oxford Review of Economics just came out a few weeks ago with Joe Stiglitz and Lord Stern and others, some of the very best economists in the world, pointing out that investments in renewable energy and sustainability approaches, dollar for dollar, create 3 times as many jobs as investments in fossil fuel infrastructure. So these crises are braided together, and the solution for the climate crisis can help us address the underlying issues that both reveal.
Yeah, and thank you. And you kind of open up to so many follow-up questions, I hardly know where to begin. But the first thing I'd ask you is, when we were talking about Zika way back, you saw a cause and effect relationship with the warming climate and the changes in climate and how it affected the mosquitoes. Do you see any cause and effect relationship between the changing climate, extreme weather, and other aspects of climate change and the sort of the advent of the virus?
Well, yes, I'd mention 2 important ones. First of all, we now know from multiple studies that the burning of fossil fuels should be understood as a precondition for higher death rates from COVID-19. A massive study of 324 cities in China showed a significant linear increase in infections and serious infections related to cities and communities where there is more particulate pollution in the air. Of course, the principal source of that is burning fossil fuels. When we burn coal and gas and oil, it creates carbon dioxide, which is the principal cause of the climate crisis. But at the same time, it creates what some people call conventional air pollution. The scientists refer to 2.5 ppm. The small particulates, the soot, and the small particles go deep in the lung. The Harvard School of Public Health came out with a warning that more burning of fossil fuels actually does create the same higher infection rate and higher death rate in the United States. The same thing happened with SARS. In Italy and Spain, the areas with the most infections, 78% of them were in the most polluted areas. They even went back and looked at the 1918-1919 flu pandemic and correlated the deaths there with the amount of coal that was burned in those cities, they found an 11% increase in infant mortality rate and a 10% increase in overall mortality rate, with even a moderate increase in air pollution. And I'm sorry to go on too long, but you've asked an important question. Let me get to the second part of the answer, Steve. We are encountering now 5 new infectious diseases every year. And 3/4 of them are called zoonotic diseases, which I now know it means they come from animals to humans.
Yeah.
And of course, that's where SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, came from bats in a region near Wuhan. And that's happening because we are steadily encroaching more and more into the previously wild areas of the world, where there are literally millions of viruses that human beings have not encountered. Now, the consequences of the climate crisis in disrupting the water cycle, creating storms like the one headed toward the U.S. coast right now, creating the fires like those that are raging in California and Nevada right now, and Oregon, actually shift the balance, along mainly with the higher temperatures, in the relationship between humans and microbes. And they shift the balance in favor of microbes. We're seeing tropical diseases move poleward, north in the northern hemisphere, south in the southern hemisphere, and air travel has a lot to do with that. But the places where they take root and become endemic is very much affected by the changed climate conditions where these viruses travel.
Very, very helpful on that point. Let's just get to remedies for a moment. So you mentioned at the outset that the kind of both climate change and COVID-19 are hitting poorer communities and communities of color much harder. And there's been a lot of talk about, okay, we now have an opportunity perhaps to do something, whether it's affordable housing, whether it's doing different, kind of looking at how we organize ourselves as a community differently to try to bridge those gaps. Do you have any specific suggestions about how to kind of use the combined effects of these two events to
racism? We've got to get past this, and both the pandemic and the climate crisis do have this differential impact. In the case of the pandemic, of course, unequal access to health care among Black Americans, also Native Americans. The highest infection rate is in the Navajo Nation, but Black Americans are suffering the brunt of the deaths and illnesses, and some of that is due to pre-existing inequities. Well before the pandemic, Black children suffer from asthma 3 times more, and the death rate among Black children from asthma is 10 times higher than the death rate among white children. Similarly, if you the fact that Black Americans are less likely to have Zoomable jobs. If you look at the cohort, the age group between 35 and 44, Black Americans of that age are dying from the pandemic 10 times more than white Americans 35 to 44. There is the wealth gap. It is shocking that the average Black family has less than 1/10 the wealth of the average white family. It takes 11.5 average Black families to make up the family wealth of one average white family. Now, where environmental justice is concerned, Black communities of color are way more likely to be downwind from the smokestacks and downstream from the hazardous waste flows and adjacent to coal ash sites and hazardous chemical waste sites, because due to institutional and structural racism, they have been deprived of the same political and economic ability to defend themselves against the location of fossil fuel infrastructure and the petrochemical complexes. And as a result, they are victimized by it. Look at Cancer Alley, about an hour north of where Hurricane Laura is due to hit tomorrow, where you have a very elevated cancer rate, because that's where they've put these plastics and petrochemicals and refineries. And you try to put one of those in a wealthy white suburb near New York City or London or Washington, D.C., you're not going to be able to do it. But they pick these locations where they realize in advance they're not going to face the same kind of opposition due to the deprivation of that political and economic power.
Yeah. So I'm going to switch away for a moment from both COVID and climate change. I promise to come back because I have additional questions on that topic. But I just want to talk a little politics with you, which I think is only fair. You won the popular vote for president in the year 2000 with an outcome that didn't quite get you into the Oval Office. But so I want to ask you a few questions. First of all, are you watching the conventions, and do you have any observations on the Democratic and the Republican conventions so far?
I thought the Democratic convention was a stunning success. Of course, I'm biased, and so I don't qualify as a focus group, but most of the focus groups and even some of the analysts on Fox News gave the Democrats credit for having a real success at that convention. And Joe Biden's speech was spectacular. Again, in my admittedly prejudiced view, I thought he did a fantastic job. We'll have to see how the rest of the Republican convention goes. I don't know. I'm, again, even a less fair judge of how they're doing.
Okay, so you don't want to comment on the GOP convention right now?
Well, we've had the first night. It didn't seem as joyful and uplifting as the president promised us it was going to be. It was pretty dark and depressing at times, but I understand they're trying to make their case. And when you, as the old lawyer cliche has it, if you have the facts, argue the facts. If you have the law, argue the law. If you have neither, shout and bang the table. I think there was a lot of shouting last night.
Back to the Democrats. Obviously, you were vice president for 8 years. What did you think of the choice of Kamala Harris as vice president? And have you spoken to her, given her any kind of suggestions about the role?
I certainly have spoken to her, but not since she was chosen. I think she's been a little busy since then, but I have spoken to her earlier in the year. I thought it was a brilliant choice. I think since the murder of George Floyd and the incredible outpouring of the reaction and the demand for change and reform really did create a new reality in this country. And selecting a woman of color was something Joe Biden decided he wanted to do. And luckily, he had a number of fantastic choices. And as Attorney General of the largest state in the union, managing that enormous organization in California, as an extremely effective senator, as a champion of solving the climate crisis, and a particular champion of dealing with climate injustice, I think she was a terrific choice.
And are you feeling okay at this point about Vice President Biden's climate policy? I know there were people who felt it wasn't strong enough during the primary campaign.
I am feeling great about it, actually. I've had quite a number of conversations with Vice President Biden, especially since he secured the nomination. And his climate policies in the primaries was good and actually more forward-leaning than any of the prior campaign cycles. But some of his opponents leaned forward a bit more, and after he secured the nomination, he wisely reached out and incorporated many, not all, but many of the proposals that his opponents had advocated. And as a result, he really has by far the strongest climate agenda that we have ever seen in a campaign in this country. And actually, this is not hyperbole, Steve. If you look carefully at his economic plan, it's obvious that a green recovery and solutions to the climate crisis are at the heart of his economic plan. Going to zero carbon electricity generation by 2035 is ambitious, aggressive, greatly needed, and I think we definitely can and will achieve it. But that's just one example, and I could go through the other planks in his personal platform, and they're all that way. He is really leaning into this crisis, and I'm very proud of what he's proposing to do.
Okay, so let's jump ahead to November 3rd and jump back to the fall of 2000. I rewatched your concession speech, and I was struck by how kind of confident and forceful you were in saying, look, it's over, it's time to move on, this country needs to move on, and there were potentially some other moves that could have been taken. I guess the first question I'd ask is, have you ever had second thoughts about conceding?
Well, first of all, when you say there were potentially some other moves, I researched them, and it turns out there's no intermediate step between a final Supreme Court decision and violent revolution. And so it seemed to me that respect for the rule of law and respect for the needs of American democracy were the orders of the day. So I did feel that it was time to recognize that a final Supreme Court decision essentially ended. I mean, you can always explore the option of dragging something out, tearing the country apart, mobilizing partisans against one another in the streets and all of that. But it was not a wise course for our country. Would not have been.
So I think you know where I'm going from here next. Do you think if President Trump loses in November, he will concede essentially in the same spirit that you conceded?
Well, I don't know. But it's important to say that it's really not up to him. And I hear people saying, well, will he accept the decision? Well, it doesn't matter. It's not up to him. Because at noon on January 20th, if a new president is elected, I hope Joe Biden is elected, and if that is the case, the police force, the Secret Service, the military, all of the executive branch officers will respond to the command and direction of the new president. And so it will not matter whether Donald Trump accepts it personally or not. I'm hoping that it will be a decisive victory, but I don't want to get ahead of myself because, like a lot of people in my political party, I felt kind of optimistic 4 years ago, and we all saw what happened. And so I don't think anybody who is a partisan for Biden and Harris are going to be relaxing or coasting just because they have a lead in the polls right now. This is going to be a turnout election, and Donald Trump's voters will turn out. He's lost some support in his base, but he will have an historic turnout, I imagine. And so Democrats have to have an even larger turnout. I'll give you an example, Steve. In the last off-year election for governor in the state of Kentucky, the incumbent Republican governor got 200,000 more votes in his bid for re-election than he did 4 years earlier. But the Democratic nominee got 300,000 more votes than the previous nominee did. And I think that's the hopeful template that Democrats are trying to apply to this election.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I want to challenge or question the sort of confidence you have that there will be a smooth and peaceful transition. I think the case that the Republicans, and particularly President Trump, is starting to make is that the election would not be legitimate because there would be substantial fraud and there would be just enough mistakes in counting the ballots that he would say that he did not lose legitimately, he lost illegitimately, and therefore either there should be a new election or he should stay in office. And I think that's the scenario that a lot of people are talking about right now. And I mean, does that scenario sound plausible to you?
Oh, of course. I mean, he claimed the popular vote was illegitimate 4 years ago. He won the Electoral College and lost the popular vote, and he went on with this nonsense about millions of undocumented immigrants coming. It was just complete nonsense, just like his birther slander against former President Obama and his stillborn efforts to pull the same stunt with Kamala Harris. He had to abandon that because even his base said, "Now we've heard that song, we're ready for something else." But he has signaled that he will challenge the election results. And yes, that's a concern. He seems to have no compunctions at all about trying to rip apart the social fabric and the political equilibrium of the American people. And he's strategically planting doubts in advance to try to undermine people's confidence in the election. So Americans of whatever party have to gird ourselves to push back against this despicable strategy that he's signaling. And of course, during the middle of the pandemic, millions of older Americans and lots of Americans of other ages with pre-existing conditions are scared that they can't breathe safely if they stand in lines at crowded polling places, and so they want to vote by mail. The studies show that voting by mail has never given an advantage to either party. In most states, Republicans have taken the lead in pushing vote by mail. But during this pandemic, it may be different because of the older Americans who are more vulnerable to it. I noticed he said yesterday that the mailboxes won't be swabbed down for COVID-19. And of course, he's put in a lackey as a Postmaster General, and to try to deprive people who are scared of the pandemic from voting by mail by dismantling the Postal Service, he's attempting to put his knee on the neck of democracy, and in the process create all of the doubts that he thinks might come back and help him by creating chaos and confusion, which is the milieu that he seems to prefer.
So I don't want to dwell on this, but my stark last question on this is, do you think the constitutional system will hold?
Yes, I do. It has for a long time now, and he has challenged most all of our existing norms and undermined the rule of law. But I'm very hopeful, and I would say confident, that it will hold. But we have to prepare for this, Steve. With the increased number of mail-in ballots, there will be a longer period of time necessary to count all those votes. I heard Donald Trump say the other night, we may not even know the election result on the night of November 3rd, on the night of the election. I thought, well, I've actually heard that, and it's happened before. But there's an extra twist this time. It is possible that the apparent result on election day may point in one direction when the mail-in ballots are eventually counted. It may flip very powerfully in the opposite direction. I think he's probably got some numbers that preview that possibility for him. And that may explain why they're taking away the mailboxes and disassembling the mail sorting machines and cutting out the overtime pay, or a lot of it, for the mail delivery people. You know, the post office was present at our founding. It's in the Constitution. Americans of whatever party want to see the Postal Service preserved. And I think he made a strategic mistake. He's going to bull forward with his strategy, I'm sure, but I think he's already finding that Republicans in the House and Senate are not eager to jump off this particular cliff with him.
Yeah. So just to give the audience a sense of where we are, we're about between 10 and 15 minutes away from my taking your questions. Your questions are coming in, frankly, by the hundreds, so I'm not going to get to all of them, but I will start asking them in between 10 and 15 minutes. But I did want to turn to some questions of tactics in the fight against climate change. And one issue that I found very interesting, because I heard your speech at Harvard about divestiture from fossil fuel companies, and obviously you got a very positive reception there. And then coincidentally, I had a conversation with Bill Gates shortly afterwards, where he was arguing strenuously against divesting, and he's written about it, divesting from fossil fuel companies, essentially saying they have all the capital they need, so you're not taking away their capital, and you need them. You need to be in partnership with them. They've got big, heavy machines that dig holes that can, bury carbon, or, you want them on your side. So can you talk that argument and explain why divestiture is important and why perhaps Bill Gates' argument isn't as sensible?
Yeah, I remember one of the early Walt Disney cartoon movies called Fantasia, a classic. Younger people in the audience may not remember it. But one of the scenes that stuck with me as a child was a ballet scene where a hippopotamus named Hyacinth was in a tutu dancing on point, and it was difficult for a hippopotamus to dance ballet. In the same way, it's difficult for an oil and gas company to suddenly shift towards sustainability and building solar panels and wind farms. Some of them may be able to do it. BP just announced a 40% reduction in their fossil fuel production and a 10-fold increase in renewable energy. They tried it once before 15 years ago, and it didn't work for them. I hope it will this time. But some of the others are still supporting the climate denial movement. And for a long time, ExxonMobil, which was probably the worst, and some others gave money to these charlatans who pretend that the climate crisis is not real. They took the playbook from the tobacco industry back when the Surgeon General and the scientists said smoking cigarettes causes lung cancer. They spent enormous amount of money hiring actors and dressing them up as doctors, putting them in front of the camera to say, "Hi, I'm a doctor, and you don't have to worry about smoking cigarettes at all." And 100 million people died. Yeah. Now, they are using that same approach to try to falsely convince people that the climate crisis is not real. Now, most of the companies, particularly the European companies, have now shifted away from that strategy. But the idea that the fossil fuel companies are going to solve this is utter nonsense. Yeah. Most of them put their advertisements on TV portraying themselves as champions of renewable energy and solving the climate crisis. And then you look and see that 99% of their budget is still spent looking for more oil and gas, when the amount that they have already proven out in their reserves, marked to market at full value on their books, two-thirds of it, according to the International Energy Agency, is not going to be burned, cannot be burned. Not because of the treaty or laws, although that may play a role, but because we are seeing a sustainability revolution, Steve, that has the magnitude of the Industrial Revolution with the speed of the digital revolution. We are seeing the kind of cost reduction curves for solar and wind and batteries and electric vehicles and thousands of hyper-efficiency technologies, the same kind of cost down curve that we saw with computer chips and mobile phones and flat screen TVs. The response to R&D leads to lower cost and simultaneously much higher quality. So let me put it this way. 5 years ago, electricity from solar and wind was cheaper than electricity from new coal and gas plants in 1% of the world. Today, renewable electricity is cheaper than new fossil electricity in 2/3 of the world. And 5 years from now, it will be cheaper in virtually 100% of the world. We're seeing the closing of these fossil fuel plants. GE just announced they're shutting down a natural gas generating plant in California 20 years ahead of schedule, replacing it with solar and batteries. Florida Power and Light shutting down 2 natural gas generating plants, replacing it with solar and batteries. We're seeing this happen all over the world. Last year, calendar year 2019, if you look at all of the new electricity generation installed worldwide, 80% of it was solar and wind, and those numbers are still increasing. In Europe, it was 88%. There was no new coal generation in the United States. And by the way, the famous coal museum north of where I am in Kentucky, they just installed solar panels on their roof.
So on that, just one more on that point, and again, not to use Bill Gates as a foil again, but is this enough without nuclear? Is nuclear sort of really what we need to get the level of energy generation that gets you out of the fossil fuel world?
Well, unfortunately, I mean, I used to be a very enthusiastic supporter of nuclear. I represented Oak Ridge, where the industry began around when I was a kid, and yet I've been very disappointed. They have priced themselves out of the market. Electricity from nuclear power plants is now by far the most expensive electricity available in the world. Put it another way, if you were the CEO of an electric utility and you wanted to build a new nuclear plant, the first 2 questions you might ask your executive team are, number one, how much will this thing cost? And there is not a single engineering consulting firm in the United States or Europe who will sign their name on an opinion, even giving an estimate. So the answer is, we have no idea. The second question is, okay, how long will it take to build it before we can start selling the electricity? And again, the answer is, oh, we have no idea whatsoever. So that might discourage you from building a new nuclear power plant. And especially when you look at the fact that the electricity from renewables is, as I've said, continuing to go down. We have now a number of utilities in Texas that have a new rate plan from 9 p.m. at night to 6 a.m. the next morning. Use all the electricity you want totally for free. It becomes zero marginal cost. And by the way, that is the reason why Pete Altmaier and Angela Merkel in Germany have just announced this green hydrogen proposal to replace coal and coking coal for steel with hydrogen produced by zero marginal cost solar and wind. Wind in the North Sea and a massive solar farm they're planning for Morocco and another one in Nigeria.
So last question from me, although I had many, many more, because I do want to get to the audience questions. But a lot of people are asking themselves, should they be doing things themselves, putting policy aside, that make a difference? Not eating meat, reducing your own carbon footprint, being good about recycling, even though frankly, you're not absolutely sure it's really going to a recycling plant. How much does individual behavior actually matter sort of quantitatively in terms of helping with climate change? And do you think people should pay a lot of attention to how they're handling carbon and in their own lifestyle?
Well, sure. Everybody can make a difference, and all the doctors say we'd all be better off eating less meat, particularly less red meat, and the climate impact of animal agriculture is large. Recycling, and it's a mess right now. I'm agreeing with what you were saying about how we feel about it. But paying attention to the climate-friendly and environmental-friendly options in the marketplace, that sends a signal up the supply chain, the distribution chain to manufacturers and designers, and that's making a difference. But here is a really important point, Steve. Part of the propaganda campaign of the fossil fuel complex several years ago was designed to try to shift the burden to every single person as an individual. What individuals can do that's most important is in their capacity as citizens and voters to demand changes in policy. We need new policies, and we need new policy makers. And the kind of movement that Greta Thunberg and her generation is demanding is exactly what we need. We need a massive shift in policies to stop subsidizing fossil fuels. The world now forces taxpayers around the world to subsidize the burning of fossil fuels at a rate 38 times greater than the meager subsidies to speed up the transition to renewables. So yes, what we do in our lives makes a difference, but what we do in our democracies makes a much bigger difference. We need to vote, we need to speak up, we need to convince others to support this movement within our political and governmental structures.
Great. Well, thank you. Let me get to as many questions as I can, but let me start with one from Sir Harry, and then we'll move to other people. So Harry asks, what has been the concrete impact of leaving the Paris Accord? And if Biden rejoins, how fast, or is it even possible to remedy the lost 4 years?
Well, first of all, under the law, international and U.S., the United States cannot leave the Paris Agreement until November 4th, the day after this upcoming election. Donald Trump stated his intention to do that, but the same legal provisions say that a new president could give 30 days notice, and then the U.S. would be right back in the agreement. Vice President Biden has said that if he is elected, he will do that on his first day as president. We have lost, not entirely, but we've lost some of these last 4 years, but we have seen the majority of people in the United States living in states that are actually moving faster than the Paris Agreement on their own, led by Washington State, Jay Inslee, California, Oregon, New York, New Jersey. We're seeing a massive movement. And cities around the United States, a lot of them have made a commitment to 100% renewable energy. Quite a few of them have already achieved that goal. And we've seen the business sector moving very powerfully. If you look at the statistics on the amount of clean renewable electricity from corporate purchase agreements, that's one of the things that's driving this renewable revolution. So when we add to this momentum that has continued, new policies that will really accelerate the transition, there is still time to solve this crisis before it reaches its catastrophic stage. Damage has already been done, and more will be done, but we still can't avoid the worst of the consequences. And as I've said earlier, by tackling this challenge, we can put tens of millions of people to work in communities where they live. We need to pay attention to a just transition. Coal miners didn't create this crisis. They're not the ones to be blamed or held responsible for it. We owe them thanks for their work in creating the civilization we have, and we owe them job training and new jobs in the communities that they call home.
Right. So these questions, since they're from the audience, will bounce around a bit, so it may make your brain gotta jump a bit. But the first question is, do you think America is in the middle of a civil war politically? What would it take to end it? Or are the 50 states headed for some sort of split from each other eventually?
No, I don't think so. Vladimir Putin has been orchestrating a strategy to try to rip the United States apart, and wherever he finds a place to drive in a wedge, he's doing it. Of course, the bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee report just a few days ago confirmed that there was actual collaboration between Donald Trump and the Russians. I'm not sure they use that exact word, collusion, collaboration, but the facts that they presented, signed by the Republicans as well as the Democrats, make it clear that's exactly what happened. We have had 40 years of middle-income families in the U.S. and most of the developed world see no significant increase in take-home pay. And over that same period of time, the wealthiest 1% or 0.1% has just gone through the stratosphere, getting wealthier and wealthier. You know, inequality is a little bit like inflation. You're always going to have a little bit. You need a little bit. It's a precondition for the incentives that unlock a higher fraction of the human potential in capitalist economies. But like inflation, we have to avoid at all costs hyper inequality. Hyperinflation destroys economies. Hyper inequality destroys both capitalism and democracy. So in healing the divisions that you referred to in the premise of your question, we have to address these underlying causes, another of which is the long overdue effort to address the structural and institutional racism that we just saw on display apparently in another Wisconsin city yesterday. And we have to deal with all of these problems that have made us vulnerable to those who want to tear the country apart.
Okay, back to a climate question, and this is essentially saying that while extreme weather events would certainly suggest climate change and be a way for climate advocates to show that there are actual changes, people who are more climate deniers or who are raising questions basically say correlation isn't the same as causation. And kind of relatedly, there was a Pew poll that said that only 20% of Republicans believe human activity contributes a great deal to climate change. And that was regardless of how much scientific knowledge they had. So sort of putting those two things together, how do you deal with, I guess, the sense that there are still people who don't see the correlation and who don't see even the extreme weather as meaning that we're in a climate change situation?
Well, I think Mother Nature has now joined the debate, and it's a little more difficult to use sophistry when you get 5 feet of rain, as they did in Houston with Hurricane Harvey, as the Bahamas did with Hurricane Dorian, as the Sundarbans area of Bangladesh and India got with that enormous cyclone that just hit them. When you have some of the biggest fires in recorded history raging right now as we're speaking in California, when you see these events, we've had 18 once-in-a-thousand-year downpours just in the last 10 years here in the United States. And the cause is not mysterious. It's been known for a long time. Every single day, we are spewing more than 150 million tons of man-made heat-trapping global warming pollution into the atmosphere. You asked about this backdrop earlier. This is a NASA picture from the space station, and this shows how thin the atmosphere is. We look up at the blue sky, and it seems like a vast and limitless expanse. But if you could drive a car straight up in the air at interstate highway speeds, you get to the top of the sky in about 5 minutes. The top of the sky is where the blue gives way to the black, and where you can no longer breathe oxygen unassisted, and where the greenhouse gas layer tops out. We're using this very narrow space, this thin shell that surrounds our planet, as an open sewer for dumping all of this heat-trapping pollution. And it stays there a long time. On average, CO2 molecules linger there for 100 years. And the cumulative amount now is trapping as much extra heat as would be released by 500,000 Hiroshima-class atomic bombs exploding every single day. How long will it take before some of those deniers who are following their chosen leaders realize that we are behaving unethically immorally and self-destructively, and imposing upon ourselves, not to mention future generations, horrific consequences. We can stop this. We are now crossing the political tipping point. That's the good news. I gave you some of the statistics earlier, but we still need the policy changes because the fossil fuel industries have 100 years of political and economic influence and political networks and lobbyists and revolving door appointees. A coal lobbyist is running the Environmental Protection Agency now, courtesy of Donald Trump. And almost all of these environmental agencies and departments are now in the clutches of the largest polluters. I'm hoping that will change on January 20th of next year.
Right, and actually wonderful segue to the next question sitting here on my queue, which is, would you accept a role in the Biden-Harris administration? And if so, what would you like it to be?
Well, thank you for asking the question. And in many ways, that's an attractive proposition. But in many ways, for me, it's not. I'm a recovering politician. The longer I go without a relapse, the less likely. Around the world starting this Friday. 10,000 applied for the training that I completed last month. I'm continuing those efforts. And in the business world, as a co-founder and chairman of Generation Investment Management, my partners and I are proving the business case that if you fully integrate sustainability and ESG factors in the investment process, you can outperform. And that's one of, and of course the studies now indicate that is the case. Asset managers that don't do it are in danger of violating their fiduciary responsibility to their clients. And we're seeing a massive shift in that direction. And so these activities in civic action, grassroots activities, and in the business world are ones that feel fulfilling and appropriate for me to apply myself to right now.
And I should mention and ask you about one of your newer initiatives where, as I understand it, you're using AI and other techniques to trace where carbon emissions are actually coming from. And can you talk a little bit about that? And also, are you planning to identify the specific provider of those emissions so that, in a sense, outing or shaming people who are creating large emissions?
Yes, but it's not just shaming. There are a lot of companies that have emissions that would like to have more accurate and real-time information to measure the progress they want to make in reducing them. There are a lot of governments who really don't know all the places where their emissions are coming from. And there's certainly a lot of climate activists around the world and investors and businesses that want their supply chains to be carbon-free who want this information. And yes, I am a part of a coalition that has 9 tech groups and companies that are filled with these experts in AI and machine learning and very sophisticated technological tools. By next June, we will make available to the world, open source, a full accounting of every human-caused emission of greenhouse gases all around the world. And yes, we will identify it by location, in real time, those who are responsible for it, and we will update most of it every 6 hours. And by painting the world transparent in the sense that we will be able to see in real time where this stuff is coming from, then that will create a completely new reality. I'm very excited about it. Climate Trace. Trace stands for Tracking Real-Time Atmospheric Carbon Emissions. And I'm very grateful. Gavin McCormick is one of my partners in this, and I could name the leaders of the other 9 groups as well if we had time. We're working very hard on it. We're very excited about it.
Great. A couple more questions. This question is generally about science. Science seems to be in the year 2020 to be surprisingly controversial. There are people who will claim that the Earth is flat, people who obviously deny climate research, people who on health and diet related issues. There are people who deny evolution. What is it about science and our culture right now that's making it as controversial and as difficult for people to accept what would ordinarily be viewed as established science?
Well, one of my classmates as an undergraduate went on to become the longtime dean of Yale Law School, Robert Post, a brilliant guy. And he made a speech in which he said, what's under attack is the authority of knowledge. I wrote a book several years ago called The Assault on Reason. When facts that illuminate what is more likely to be true than not leads to decisions that are inconvenient for powerful interests that have political and economic connections, they are tempted to try to squash the facts, to try to challenge the authority of knowledge, to launch an assault on the reasoning that leads people to different conclusions that are not in their interest. But what has made the United States, pardon the pride, the greatest country in the world, is that until not too long ago, we made better decisions than any other nation by relying on the collective wisdom of the American people, harvesting the wisdom of crowds through the regular election process. But some of these powerful moneyed interests have tried to disrupt that process and impose their preferred policies that will further enrich them and empower them at the expense of everyone else.
So we're very close to closing, and I do want to ask you a question that I think about a lot. And that is, you know, as a species, are we equipped, are we built, are we programmed to look out a number of years at these long-term issues and stay focused on them so that we can make progress on them? And there's this term, I was reading generational amnesia, the notion that people just get used to the way it is. You're going to forget that it's not always 95 or 100 degrees, or that your Miami isn't always being flooded. And you're just going to start accepting it. And we're going to be working on mitigation and creating levees and dams, but we're not going to have the sustained capability of focusing on the issue, because that's kind of not what we were created, you know, what we evolved to do. I mean, just what's your thought on that? Because you've always been so optimistic. I'd just love to hear you kind of frame your optimism as against that concern.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, let me say, I think that we need to be cautious about too easily accepting false neoliberal optimism and a Pollyanna view that everything is going to be fine no matter what. But we also have to avoid the pessimistic conclusion that some have, and the premise of your question gets at this. Decades ago, a scientist used a geeky phrase in saying to me, he said, Al, what's being tested here is whether or not the combination of an opposable thumb and a neocortex is a viable combination on this planet. And it's quite right that we carry with us the evolutionary legacy of our long period of development and creation, in that we respond readily to the kinds of threats that our ancient ancestors appeared. The flashing of a big cat's teeth, a snake, or other humans with clubs for a lot of that was the biggest threat for a long period. But in spite of our limiting factors, we also have the ability to transcend our limitations and rise above the weaker parts of our nature. And we have seen this done repeatedly in the past when the chips were down and we had to rise to the occasion. If you look at the effort to abolish slavery, there were long periods when the advocates felt despair. If you look at the struggle for women's suffrage, and here we are in the 100th anniversary this week of the women's suffrage success here in the United States. Again, many thought that would be impossible. The civil rights movement, the anti-apartheid movement, more recently the gay and lesbian equality movement. But all of those movements eventually succeeded. Wallace Stevens, the great poet who was a businessman before he devoted himself entirely to poetry, once wrote, after the last no comes a yes. And on that yes, the future world depends. We have the ability together to chart a course into the future that's manifestly better for us and our progeny. We know how to do it. We can do it. And for any who actually are tempted to the pessimistic view that we just lack the political will necessary, remember that political will is itself a renewable resource.
Well, that's as good a place to end as any. I want to thank you very much for joining us. It was highly illuminating, and thank everybody for participating. And we're out. So thanks again.
Thanks to you, and thanks to Harry.
Thanks to Harry.